Sigmund Freud's work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, represents one of the most significant and complex theoretical contributions to psychoanalysis. This work delves deeply into the nature of human instincts, psyche, and the unconscious. It builds upon Freud's previous theories while introducing new concepts that would shape his thinking and the future of psychoanalytic theory. The core of the work lies in Freud's exploration of the relationship between the pleasure principle, which drives human behavior, and the emergence of an additional principle that seems to oppose it, which he calls the death drive. Context of the work. Beyond the Pleasure Principle was written in the aftermath of World War I, a period of profound disillusionment and cultural upheaval. Freud, who had already developed his theories of the unconscious, repression, and the libido, was now faced with the inexplicable human destructiveness and suffering brought on by the war. The brutality of the war and its psychological impact on individuals seemed to challenge the idea that humans are primarily motivated by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, a central tenet of Freudian theory at the time. Freud's earlier work, particularly his theory of the pleasure principle, posited that human behavior was largely governed by the desire for pleasure and the avoidance of discomfort. The pleasure principle drives the psyche to seek pleasure, satisfaction, and a reduction of tension. However, the events of the war and certain clinical observations led Freud to reconsider this view and explore the possibility that there may be deeper, more destructive forces at work in the human mind. The pleasure principle and the reworking of drive theory. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud revises his earlier theory of drives. In his previous works, he had posited that the libido, the sexual drive, was the central motivating force behind human behavior. This drive was understood as a source of pleasure, and human actions were believed to be primarily motivated by a desire to satisfy it. However, Freud's work on Beyond the Pleasure Principle expanded this view. He introduces the notion of two distinct kinds of drives, the eros, life drive, and thanatos, death drive. Eros is associated with the instinct to live, love, create, and build, while thanatos represents the instinct toward destruction, aggression, and death. Freud suggested that both these forces coexisted in the human psyche and that they were often in conflict with each other. Whereas the pleasure principle was aligned with the life drive, it became clear to Freud that there was a counteracting force that could not be reduced to a mere need for pleasure. The most striking element of Beyond the Pleasure Principle is the introduction of the death drive, thanatos. Freud proposed that there exists an instinct that drives people toward death, destruction, and self-annihilation. This death instinct is a counterpoint to the life instinct, eros, and together they form the foundation of Freud's revised drive theory. The death drive is not merely a desire for the end of life, but manifests in various forms, such as aggression, cruelty, and a compulsive repetition of trauma. Freud based this idea partly on his clinical observations, including cases where patients appeared to repeat traumatic experiences in a way that did not appear to be pleasurable, but instead destructive. He also pointed to phenomena such as masochism, self-harm, and violent tendencies as evidence of the existence of a drive toward destruction. Freud's concept of the death drive was an attempt to account for these forms of behavior, which seemed to resist the pleasure principle. He argued that there is an inherent tendency in all living beings toward entropy, or the return to an inorganic state. This drive toward the unmaking of life was not simply a psychological anomaly, but, according to Freud, a fundamental aspect of human nature. The death drive also helped Freud to explain behaviors that could not be accounted for by his earlier theories. For instance, individuals who were exposed to trauma often exhibited a tendency to repeat their traumatic experiences, not for pleasure, but for reasons that seemed to be beyond the pursuit of satisfaction. This phenomenon led Freud to revise his understanding of the unconscious and its role in shaping human behavior. The repetition compulsion. One of the key elements of Beyond the Pleasure Principle is Freud's exploration of the repetition compulsion. Freud observed that many individuals suffering from trauma would compulsively repeat experiences that mirrored their traumatic events. For example, a war veteran might relive the horrors of battle, or a survivor of childhood abuse might enter into abusive relationships. Freud found that these patients were not seeking pleasure or gratification, but were instead unconsciously compelled to repeat the traumatic event. The repetition compulsion seemed to challenge the idea that the human psyche is always seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. Instead, it suggested that there might be an unconscious drive to return to earlier experiences, even if those experiences were painful or destructive. Freud hypothesized that this compulsion was linked to the death drive, as it involved a return to an earlier, more primal state, often one marked by destruction or self-annihilation. Freud's work on the repetition compulsion expanded his understanding of trauma and its effects on the psyche. It also opened up new avenues for understanding how the unconscious mind operates, particularly in the context of psychological disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Freud's ideas about the repetition compulsion would later influence the development of psychodynamic and trauma-based therapies. The role of the unconscious. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud also deepens his exploration of the unconscious mind. He had already established that much of human behavior is shaped by unconscious desires, fears, and memories. However, with the introduction of the death drive and the repetition compulsion, Freud expanded the scope of the unconscious to include not only repressed desires, but also deeper, more instinctual forces. The unconscious, according to Freud, is not just a repository of repressed wishes or memories, but also the site of powerful drives, including the life and death instincts. These drives are not consciously accessible, but they manifest in behaviors, dreams, and symptoms. Freud's revision of the unconscious mind as a battleground for conflicting instincts provided a more nuanced and complex understanding of human psychology. The impact on psychoanalytic theory. Beyond the Pleasure Principle marked a turning point in Freud's thinking and had a lasting impact on the field of psychoanalysis. The introduction of the death drive fundamentally altered the way psychoanalysts thought about human motivation and pathology. It suggested that humans are not simply driven by the pursuit of pleasure, but also by destructive instincts that can lead to suffering and self-destruction. The death drive also influenced later developments in psychoanalytic theory, particularly in the work of Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, and other post-Freudian theorists. The concept of the death drive would later be explored in relation to existential philosophy, human aggression, and the social dynamics of violence and war. While Beyond the Pleasure Principle was groundbreaking, it was also controversial. Freud's introduction of the death drive was met with skepticism by some of his contemporaries, including his close colleague Carl Jung, who rejected the idea of a death instinct in favor of a more optimistic view of human nature. Many critics questioned Freud's assertion that human beings have an intrinsic drive towards self-destruction and saw it as a pessimistic view of the human condition. Nevertheless, Freud's ideas about the death drive and the repetition compulsion have had a profound influence on psychoanalysis and related fields. His work has been revisited and revised by many theorists and clinicians over the years, and his exploration of human destructiveness remains a cornerstone of modern psychoanalytic thought. Beyond the Pleasure Principle is one of Sigmund Freud's most significant and complex works. By introducing the death drive and the repetition compulsion, Freud expanded his understanding of human motivation and the unconscious. His theory of the life and death instincts challenged the previously held notion that human beings are solely driven by the pursuit of pleasure, offering a more nuanced view of the human psyche. Despite its controversy, the work has had a lasting impact on psychoanalysis and continues to be studied and debated by scholars and practitioners alike. Freud's exploration of human destructiveness and the unconscious remains a powerful lens through which we can examine the complexities of human behavior.